Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Building Healthy, Strong Communities virtual conference. This is our fifth and final session of the conference, Protect Trans Youth, How Social Workers Can Show Up Across Micro, Mezzo, and Macro Practice. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You will see the first two momentarily. There will be time for Q&A throughout the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will add them to the list. We do encourage participation in the chat throughout today's presentation. We're going to wait just a few more moments to get started, so sit tight and remember to respond to the polls when you see them. All right, here comes poll number one. We are just asking who is in attendance today, and feel free to elaborate on your answer in the chat so that we can see who's here. Introduce yourself. For anyone that is just now joining us, we are just responding to the poll that you see on this screen. And if the poll function from Zoom does not pop up on your screen, you are always welcome to put your answer in the chat. That works just fine. So just asking who is in attendance, and go ahead and elaborate in the chat. I'll leave this one up there for about 20 more seconds, and then we're going to move on to the next one. It looks like we have a lot of alumni here today. Love it. Moving on to our next poll. So how familiar are you with this topic area? So remember, the title for today's talk is Protect Trans Youth, How Social Workers Can Show Up Across Micro, Mezzo, and Macro Practice. For anyone that might have just joined, we're just completing the polls. If you missed the first one, that's no problem. We're just asking who's in attendance. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, and then let us know how familiar you are with this topic area. I'll leave this one on the screen for about 15 more seconds, and then we will introduce today's speakers. All right, so it looks like we've got a little bit of a mix on familiarity. One person said they're an expert, so hopefully you've got some comments to put in the chat. All right, so now I'm going to introduce our fabulous speakers for today. First is Dr. Shanna Katari. Shanna Katari is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and the director of Sexuality, Relationship, and Gender Research Collective. Their practice and community background is a board-certified sexologist, certified sexuality educator, and social justice advocate. Dr. Katari's current research focuses on understanding how power, privilege, and oppression systematically marginalize, exclude, and discriminate against people regarding their identities and expressions through negative attitudes, policies reinforcing oppression, oppressive actions, and isolation. Recently, they have focused on the health disparities among trans and gender diverse communities across physical and behavioral health, as well as working with the community through community-based participatory research and arts-based research methods to better understand how the lack of inclusive providers has increased their disparities. Next is Leo Katari. Leo is a doctoral candidate at the Michigan State School of Social Work and a lecturer at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. Their research explores LGBTQ+ health and wellness with a particular focus on transgender and gender diverse related civic engagement and community change. He is a passionate advocate for equity and justice with over a decade of experience in the areas of health education, health policy, community mobilization and organizing, and advocacy through storytelling. They have provided presentations, trainings, and consultation services on leadership development, cultural responsiveness, putting data into action, and storytelling techniques throughout the U.S. to agencies such as the Mayo Clinic, various state and county health departments, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Adolescent Health. He is invested in community-driven and data-informed action and advances health equity through public policy, funding priorities, and innovative systems change. And I now pass things on to Leo and Shanna.
Did we get the music turned down?
Yes, I will shut it right off.
Awesome. And Leo, do you want to share our PowerPoint? Well, thank you so much and welcome to #ProtectTransYouth, how social workers can show up across micro, mezzo, and macro practice. There's an image on the screen of a white non-binary femme in a teal dress pointing intensely at a white trans masculine non-binary person who is wearing a hat that says, "Don't mess with trans kids," and a shirt that says, "Gender affirming healthcare saves lives." So that's me and Leo. That's who you get today. As full disclosure, we are also in the process of navigating an end-of-life transition for one of our older cats, and my mother is in the hospital right now. So we're here, but if we seem a little discombobulated, we are also trying to navigate life's things as we are here. Looks like everything is looking good. So Leo, you're gonna have to switch slides for me. I also want to remind us of whose space we are on here at the University of Michigan. I'll quote Ramona Beltran in saying, "As we live and learn on these territories, we must keep in mind the community struggles for self-determination and the colonial legacies of scholarly practice." I also have the official acknowledgement that we all put on. We acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. But what I also want us to think about as social workers is how do we advocate for Indigenous struggles in a world that is full of settler colonization and move towards an actually decolonized future. And that's another one of these words we love throwing around here in social work, decolonizing this and decolonizing that, without remembering that decolonizing includes giving land back, includes centering Indigenous knowledge and beliefs. It means supporting our Indigenous clients, our Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. So really encourage you to think about what this means to you personally in your spaces, whether it's supporting land back movements or real rent movements in your area, or just connecting with Indigenous communities so that we're not only acknowledging whose land we are on, but also doing something with that. So you got the full intensive bio, but the important bits is that I always tell people I'm not a real social worker. I play one on TV. So I have a master's of human sexuality education, and then went back and got my PhD in social work because of the social justice focus of the field, with work around sexuality, gender, and disability. Over a decade, actually probably closer to almost 2 decades as a sexuality educator. I also think it's important to talk about who is at the front of the room or the front of the screen right now, and the identities that I hold, both privileged and marginalized. So I'm white, non-binary, middle class, English speaking, Jewish, Jewitchy, neurodivergent, disabled, chronically ill, and I'm a queer, fat, polyam femme, and I have US citizenship privilege. And the way that I see myself in various spaces, in addition to being a, researcher and educator, is I see myself as a social justice advocate, as a bridge builder. I always tell my students that we need people on the outside breaking down the walls, and we need people on the inside slowly taking out the bricks and the mortar one at a time. And I hope to be that person that bridges those spaces. And as you may guess, I'm an institutional boundary pusher. So some of the things that I say, and I'm going to speak for Leo for a second, that we say today might seem out there or different or radical than things you've heard in traditional social work spaces. And they're all really grounded in social work values. And so, just giving you that heads up. I also, as you've noted, I'm a cat mom. And so I've got 2 here that are sleeping, but you might get an interruption or 2 at a time. So that's me. Leo, you want to do your spiel?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Leo. I use he and they pronouns. It's one of the coolest things to be able to present and do really transformative presentations and trainings with your partner. And so, yes, it's pretty rad. So I'm currently a PhD candidate at Michigan State in social work, so I'm in the process of becoming a PhD, but I teach courses at the UM School of Social Work, really focused on community change and policy practice. And my identities are, I'm also white, I'm transmasculine, middle-class English-speaking, neurodivergent, non-disabled, and queer person with US citizenship. And it is really important to position ourselves in the work we're doing, no matter what kind of practice we're engaging in. I consider myself a transformative leader, liberation-minded, and similar to Shanna's institutionally boundary pusher. I'm a status quo challenger. I like to encourage curiosity and question why things are the way they are. And then I'm also pet parent. So I have a cat in the background here who you will hear meowing at some point. I also have a dog, Marla Pooch, named after Marla Hooch from A League of Their Own. For anyone who knows that reference, you get 20 points. So you might hear her respond to things as well. And I just we want to normalize that we're in our house, where our house is our homes, our businesses, and there's distractions. So we're going to get that out of the way now that it's going to happen. So we're going to lean into it. There we go.
So just basic guidelines, housekeeping for our space. I know Emma has put some in as well. But why are we here? We are assuming best intent for everyone. And I'm guessing that if you are spending your afternoon with us today, that you care deeply about trans and gender diverse youth and want to support them in, at the very least, surviving this world that we are in, if not surviving and thriving at the same time. So we're all going to assume that people are here for that same reason. If you are not here for that reason, this is not the space for you. If you're here to argue about the validity of trans young people or gender or anything like that, we're happy to talk with you offline for that, but this is really a space to support trans young people. Questions are welcome and encouraged. You can use the chat box, you can use the Q&A. We're pretty good at following both of them. We'll also have all of our information up at the end, so you can reach out to us if you have questions that pop up later or something you don't feel comfortable asking. You can also use the anonymous Q&A box or back channel something to us. And we're here for open and honest communication. It's really okay to not know answers. I always give the example. I used to teach the Intro to Trans Studies class at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And the first 2 semesters I taught it, we talked about trans and gender nonconforming people. And by the next semester, a lot of my students were like, professor, we don't use gender nonconforming anymore. Now we want to say gender expansive or non-binary or gender diverse. And so things are very fluid when it comes to this. And so it's also okay to say, I don't know. I will say, in case you're not aware, a policy went into place in Alabama 2 days ago that made providing gender affirming care for trans young people a felony. And so most people are not aware of that because it is no accident that it happened at the very similar time as the Roe leak. And so people are having to focus on one thing at a time. So I just want to note that, like, we might not know the answer to a question we ask. And, if you don't know the answer, all questions are welcome. We all come from different spaces, some clinical, some macro, some in between, community organizers. Some of you may be trans or gender diverse yourself. Some of you may have trans and gender diverse kids or family members. So we're all going to have different reactions. Whatever your feelings and reactions are valid. Yana says in the chat, that's atrocious. That's how I feel. Right. But yeah, so I just wanted to note that. I also want to note that this is a self-care and disability affirming space. So, if you need, I've got fidget toys here. If you need to stand up, move your body, sit down, lay down, I've got an ice pack with me, water to hydrate. I just want everybody to take care of themselves in this space, especially after a long day of trainings. And Kelly says, feelings don't need to be spelled correctly. I love that. Nothing needs to be spelled correctly. This is a space for us to connect and learn and grow. And, A, I'm not grading anybody, but B, even if I was, nobody loses points for spelling feelings incorrectly. All right, Leo. Okay, so on the front end, I'm going to be giving a little bit of a, what are we even talking about here? And then Leo's going to talk a little bit about the policies that are happening, how social work orgs are or are not responding to things. I'm going to talk a little bit about resistance and resilience, and then Leo's going to give his awesome storytelling training, and they're just going to hopefully give you some skills that you can use in your space. Yana's appreciative of Kelly's thoughts, and James says, finally a good reason for an MSW to be a felon, which is actually, I just want to note for a great point, is that laws exist and they're not always just, right? Historically, we've had a lot of laws in this country that are not just. And so we often talk about, should MSWs have felonies? If the felony is to do something that is just, right? Like, that's a whole different conversation about the prison industrial complex and all of that. But this really is a time of reckoning for social workers and folks who work in social work healthcare, because it may become a felony to do things that are like basic human rights. So it is a big, challenging time to be. Okay, let's talk about alphabet soup for a second. So you may have heard the term GLBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, 2S+, LGBTQQAA, LGBTQIA, 2SOP, and it is constantly shifting and evolving because as people are feeling more comfortable and supported in exploring their own identities, oftentimes people are co-creating new identities or being in community. So when we talk about this alphabet soup, we're actually usually talking about 5 different things. Really 4, but I would say 5 when we're talking more in depth. We're talking about sex, we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about gender expression, and we're talking about sexual orientation, which is correlated to or not romantic and emotional orientation. So we're going to delve in for a second. So sex. This is what is assigned at birth, right? I want you to think about, back up for a second, Leo. We're not there yet. Okay, it's a Lion King moment, right? The child is held up by the doctor, the midwife. What is the first question that we ask? I'll make you all engaged. Yes, Justine, Katie, everybody got, is it a boy or is it a girl? Right? Brenda said, I'm not sure, Brenda, what your question is, right? But yes, everybody's like, is it a boy or is it a girl? Side note, we might also ask like 10 fingers, 10 toes, but that's a disability and ableism talk. Yes, Amy, is the baby breathing, right? One of the first questions we want to know is it a boy or is it a girl? And this is that moment that at birth, the doctor or the provider of some sort will assign the child to be male, which is assigned male at birth, AMAB, or female, assigned female at birth. And in the case of, for example, ambiguous genitalia is what they used to call it, which is everybody has phallic material, but a phallus that was a certain length is considered a penis. A phallus that is a certain length is considered a clitoris. And anybody in between, there would be a panic, and they'd say that person is intersex. Although it is also possible that intersex people can be assigned intersex later in life. So if their genitalia matches up to assumptions of what things, quote, should look like, but then they're in their 20s and are trying to have a kid and realize they have a vagina but 2 testes, or they have a penis but an ovary and a testy, or penis and a uterus, right? So intersex can look like lots of different things. But this is the sex that was assigned at birth. And it is using the best guess of what we know, right? So if you'll go on to the next. We use 4 things in our society to assess for, nope, go back. I want engagement here. What are the, so if you're really quick, you know all the answers if you read them already. But what are the 4 things we use in our society to assess for sex throughout the lifespan? Okay, so, oh, awesome. I'm loving all of this. Okay, so all of you that are saying the way someone looks, appearance, clothing, all of that, I'm going to put that in a separate category because we're actually going to come back to that. That has nothing to do with sex, okay? That is gender presentation, gender expression. So some of you said genitalia. Yes, right. This is the easy one that everybody usually gets first, the junk. Right? Is your phallus this long, or is it this long? Is there a hole in a certain area, or is it elsewhere? And in that case, the doctor says, or the midwife says, male, female, easy as that. Okay. Other things, Jen says, secondary sex characteristics. Absolutely. So these are things like, do you have facial hair? How much facial hair do you have? Are your hips wide? Are your shoulders wide? Are you tall? Are you short? Is your voice low? Is your voice high? Right? Do you menstruate or not? Where is your fat distributed? All of those questions. Okay. Then Jennifer Wekenell comes in. This is the one people usually miss. It's the gonads, which are your internal sex organs. So that's like ovaries, testes, etc. And then I saw, yep, Amy cheated, but acknowledged it. A lot of you all have chromosomes, right? So as Amy said, XX, XY, and other genetics. There's lots of other chromosomal combinations. We tend in our society to say XX and XY are the only 2 options, but that's not the case. There are triple X, there's XXY, there's X partial Y, there's all sorts of ways that result in people being intersex. And just so you have the language, endosex is the opposite of intersex. So if you are someone for whom your secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, gonads, and chromosomes all are in alignment, right, with assumptions from society, then you're endosex. So I am endosex based on those things. Versus if you're someone who has some from column A, some from column B, some from column C, maybe somewhere in the middle, then you're intersex. All right, Leah, great. So everybody has a phallus. They actually used to use a phallometer to assess when children were born, the length of their phallic tissue. And if it was a certain length, they would, say male, certain length, female. And if it was in between, in about 95% of cases, doctors would do emergency surgery, sometime without the knowledge or consent of the parents, to assign the child female because, and I quote, an actual physician, it is easier to dig a hole than build a pole. So intersex folks have a big struggle in life as well. We're not going to focus on that today, but something to think about, as a lot of intersex people are also trans. All right, Leo.
Do you want to ask this last question?
Oh, yes. Sorry. I got so excited about intersex folks. Okay. Where are some places in life that you might be required to enter your sex? Driver's license. Absolutely. Intake forms for healthcare, school, licenses, passport, your taxes, flight information, job applications, employment applications, and all forms. NO says, yes, your school applications, your FAFSA, just about anywhere. BuzzFeed quizzes sometimes, online shopping, medical appointments, any socio-legal documentation, car insurance, right? So this thing that we've assigned at birth somewhat randomly, because at birth, we don't know secondary sex characteristics, right? At birth, we don't know what someone's gonads look like. And at birth, we don't know what their chromosomes are, except in rare cases, right? Like my mother in the 80s was a quote geriatric pregnancy. And so she had to get genetic counseling and all of this. So I have a chart that tells me what my chromosomes are. I thought I was really cool in high school biology. And so I brought it to class when we talked about chromosomes. I was not cool, still not cool. But I know what my chromosomes are. But I would say most people don't know what their actual chromosomes are. Leo, do you know your chromosomal makeup? Right. So we don't know. So we're literally basing all of these things that follow you through your life and sometimes have really big implications, right? Like if you have a M on your driver's license, your car insurance costs you more until you're 25. Right? We're basing this all on people's junk, which is really weird to me as a feminist. I'm like, wow, we are literally basing entire like life assignments based on people's genitals. And what I want us to think about for a second are, do we know males that have breast tissue? Yeah. Do we know females that don't have breast tissue? Absolutely. Do we know females who are tall? I don't know, the whole freaking NBA. Do we know males who are short? Yes. Do we know females who have facial hair? There's an entire industry in the world, right, that is about removing female people's facial hair. Do we know males that have high voices and females that have low voices? Absolutely, right? So a lot of these things that we're arbitrarily using to design for sex are not accurate. Right. So oftentimes people will say, well, gender is a construct, but sex is biological. But what I want everybody to think about is that sex isn't actually that biological either. We've created a construct of what we want things to be, but it is not inherent. All right, next slide, please. So when I use this language, transgender or trans is someone whose sex assigned at birth does not meet up with the social expectations of the gender we associate with that sex. So if you are assigned male at birth and you're like, cool, I'm a feminine person or I'm a woman, right? That is probably trans in some way. Similarly, if you're assigned female at birth and you're like, I'm masculine or I'm non-binary, right? Then that's trans in some way. Thanks, Julie. Julie said she liked what I had to say about sex. Cisgender or cis, C-I-S, is when your sex assigned at birth and your social expectations match up with the gender that we connect with that sex. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I believe Emma, please correct me if I am wrong, but Emma is cisgender, right? And the term cisgender was coined by Julia Serrano, and people get like all upset about it for some reason. They think it's a negative term, but it literally in science, she's a chemist, cis means to stay in the same direction, and trans means to cross over or go different directions. So cisgender, your sex and gender assumptions are aligned. Transgender, your sex and assumptions and gender are not aligned. That's all it means. So just, you'll hear me use the term cis and trans, and that's where that comes from. Gender identity is who you know yourself in your heart, in your soul to be. And everybody has a gender identity. For some reason, we have the idea that only trans people have a gender identity. But if you were like, I am woman, hear me roar, that is your gender identity, right? So you can be a cis woman, you can be a trans woman, you could be a trans feminine person, you could be a cis man, a trans masculine person. I'm non-binary. Some people abbreviate that to NB, ENBY, which is literally how you would say the letter N and the letter B out loud. Genderqueer. Two-spirit is a little bit different. It is an indigenous specific identity. The language was created to talk about all of the different genders that exist in indigenous tribes in North America, but colonizers were using really harmful language, and so they came up with a term in English to recognize both gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity in indigenous communities. That term is a closed term, and it is not for non-indigenous folks. I'm looking at you, Jason Mraz. Agender, right? So those are folks that are like, my gender is not non-binary. I just don't have a gender, right? Like, that was really nice of you to offer that, but I'm just going to put that down and walk away. right? Gender fluid. So those are folks that are like, maybe I'm feeling a little this way today. Maybe I'm feeling a little that way. Or like, I'm going to take some of this and some of that and mix it all up and ta-da. But again, these are like who you know yourself to be. And so somebody's gender identity may or may not align with, next slide, their gender expression, right? And this is where a lot of you had put like, how do we know this? This is how society wants us to think we box people in, but it's not always accurate, right? So this is how someone presents themselves to the world and can include all of these things you mentioned before, including hairstyles, clothes, makeup, jewelry, facial hair, how someone walks, how someone sits, how someone inflects their voice, right? In our society, if you end with more of a question, that's considered more feminine. But if you end with a solid statement, that's considered more masculine. I remember in one of my first classes, my freshman year of undergrad, it was all women except for 2 men. And the teacher said, freeze. And everybody froze. She said, look around the room. And every single woman or feminine person was leaning forward, right? Closed off with their body. And the 2 masculine people were sitting, taking space and legs open, splayed, right? Since then, we now have a term mansplaining, manspreading. But at the time, it was this really good moment of how we've been trained to use our bodies in ways that may not feel accurate to who we are. It is important to remember that gender identity does not equal gender expression in all cases. I am non-binary. Do not identify as a woman. I do not use she, her pronouns, but I present in a femme way, in a very feminine way. It doesn't make me any less non-binary. Right? And so this is why it is so important to ask everybody their pronouns, to share your pronouns with everyone, and to not make assumptions about people's gender, especially with young people who might not have access to different clothing, different hairstyles, other things. You might have someone that looks like me that uses he pronouns or wants to use he pronouns in private settings with you to like test it out or feel affirmed, but might not be able to dress in a different way or looks like me and uses he pronouns because that's what feels accurate, right? And so Elizabeth wants to know about how non-binary and agender are different. So for me, I have a very strong gender identity. I am a non-binary femme. This is my gender. And like when I figured out what my gender was, it was the way I used to describe it was when I was a woman, it felt like I was wearing a really nice coat, but it didn't fit right. Right. It was just a little uncomfortable and didn't work for me. But when I was able to say I am non-binary femme, like the coat was tailored perfectly and it worked for me. Right. Folks who are agender are often like, I don't want to talk about gender. Like, I'm just going to dress the way I want to dress and be the way I want to be. And like, gender is not an important piece for me. Now, here's the thing. Different identity means different things to different people. So the best thing you can always do, and I learned this from Leo when he was in his MSW program, is when somebody says something like, I am a gender queer, fluid, magic unicorn, faggy fairy, which some people will say to you, you can say, oh, will you tell me what that means to you? Or what does that look like to you? Right? Because non-binary to me might look different to other non-binary people. Leo is transmasculine, but is very intentional about not identifying as a man, where some people who are transmasculine are like, yeah, I'm a man of trans experience, right? Everybody has their different ways, although they would still probably both identify under the transmasculine umbrella. So saying things like, oh, tell me what that means to you, or tell me what that looks like to you, can get you a lot more information. Next slide, please. Okay. So sexual orientation is who you're sexually attracted to or interested in being in some sort of sexual relationship with. So these terms could include lesbian, straight or heterosexual, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, omnisexual, two-spirit, there's that again, asexual, and that includes the ace spectrum, so also demisexual, gray sexual, etc., which is potentially connected to, but doesn't have to be connected to, who you are romantically or emotionally attracted to. So the way that I explain this to people, and I hope this has not jumped the shark yet, but who you are, your sexual orientation is who you want to Netflix and chill with, and your romantic orientation is who you want to Netflix and actually chill with. How is omnisexual different from pansexual? That is one of those questions you have to ask people for whom those identities they hold. In my mind, when Leo and I do research together, we usually code bisexual, pansexual, queer, and omnisexual together as folks who are multisexual, who are attracted to multiple genders. For some people, they're like, but bisexual is different than pansexual in these very specific ways, which is different than omnisexual. And then some people are like, yeah, any of those words, just something that indicates more than one, right? So this is a really great example, Kelly, of saying like, oh, pansexual, will you tell me what that means to you? Or what was your process of choosing that word? Right? How did you come to that identity? Again, if it's appropriate. Like if you're just like in a space with a random trans person, maybe don't ask that. But like if you are doing counseling work, if you're working in a school setting, if you're supporting parents who are supporting a kid, right? Like, yeah, tell me how that identity showed up for you. So these can overlap. Somebody could be gay and homoromantic, attracted to men sexually, attracted to men emotionally. It's great. Or they could be different. So somebody could be asexual, not interested in sex, but heteroromantic. Or someone could be a lesbian and panromantic. And people can also be aromantic. So somebody could be pansexual and aromantic, for example. Society likes to combine these two a lot. I will say for folks that are socialized as women and girls, there's more space to explore that. If you think about what like a high school sleepover looks like, right? Like people braid each other's hair and people might like give each other massages and sleep all in the same bed. And so there's space to have that like emotional and romantic connection to people of similar genders. But that's not allowed for boys and young men, right? Like that would be seen as, hashtag no homo or anything like that. So we tend to smush them together, but especially amongst gender diverse and queer youth, you're going to see a lot more of the like, I'm a non-binary, trans feminine, aromantic, omnisexual person. And so just being prepared to see like how all of those things work together is really important. All right, next slide. So the biggest language notes I can give you are mirror what your clients use. So sometimes language is seen as outdated. So in general, I wouldn't use the word homosexual or transsexual generally, because some people are offended by that language. But if somebody says to you, I'm a homosexual woman or I'm a transsexual man, like use that language. Do not ever come back and be like, well, Dr. Shanna Katari said I'm not allowed to say, right? Mirror the language that people use. Some language can be regional, cultural, or age specific. So like when I work with older adults, I usually don't start with queer unless they do, because it has been used pejoratively. So just asking like, how do you identify, or tell me about your orientation is really useful. Similarly, like in Black communities, especially in urban areas, AG or aggressives are folks that could be seen as lesbian, could be seen as gender diverse, and kind of straddle that. But that's again a racial specific construct like two-spirit, and isn't something that like I could not identify as that, right? So just figuring out where people are and being aware of the language in your areas. Next slide, please. If nothing else, use the correct pronouns, even if you don't understand. When working with trans young people, please use the correct names and their correct pronouns. Like if nothing else comes out of my portion of this talk, you don't have to understand it. You could be like, I don't understand Z here. I don't know how that works. That is okay. You don't have to understand someone to provide them basic respect. And practice when they're not around. If you have a client or you have a nibbling, which is the gender inclusive term for a niece or a nephew, that is suddenly, saying, please use this, then you work with your colleagues, you work with your family members to practice talking about them using the correct pronouns. Ask people to correct you, ask people to practice with you. As a note, as somebody who uses they, them pronouns, I saw this meme like 2 years ago, and it's one of my favorite things to share because people get really anxious about they, them pronouns, which is interesting because we use them all the time anyways, right? If you see a really cute dog on the side of the road with their owner, you're not going to be like, oh my gosh, he or she is so cute. What is his or her name? Is it okay if I pet him or her? You say, oh my gosh, your dog is so cute. What's their name? And is it okay if I pet them? Right? We use them already. We just have trouble thinking about it in this way. So there's a meme of a young queer person who was taking their non-binary partner home to meet their dad or her dad. And she was really worried her dad was going to misgender her partner while they were there. And the weekend went well. The dad did not mess up once. And afterwards, she went to him and said, Dad, like, how did you do? I know you were struggling. And he was like, I don't really get it. So I just thought about your partner, Taylor, and that Taylor has a mouse hanging out in their pocket. And so whenever I was talking about Taylor, I'd think about Taylor and their mouse, right? So it was them, Taylor and the mouse in the pocket. So I was talking about two people. So if you really struggle with it, just envision a mouse in my pocket. And right, because at the end of the day, even if you don't understand it, even if you have to use these tips, one thing we know is that using correct names and pronouns reduces suicide rates amongst trans young people. Like that is one of the biggest things you can do. And young people are scrappy and creative as all get out. So they're going to come up with new language. They're going to bring back old stuff all the time where I'm like, oh, I thought we moved past that, but here we are again. Just use what they use. And if you don't know what it is, right? That example I gave is I had somebody fill out the trans health survey here in Michigan, and they filled in their gender as faggy glitter horror trans femme. And I have no idea what that means, right? I don't know what that means. So you say, like, oh, can you tell me what that means to you? Or like, tell me what that looks like. That's totally okay. Yes, Carolyn says, ask what someone wants, and Emma loves nibbling. So nibbling is like sibling, but niece or nephew. All right, Leo, next slide. So just something to do on your own, and it's on the resource list, is the gender unicorn. And sometimes people talk about the genderbread person, but that was actually stolen from a trans woman of color from a white cisgender gay man and then monetized. So we don't do the genderbread person. This was created by trans young people, and you can go to transstudent.org/gender. And the gender unicorn, also, I like that it's not boxes or a spectrum that puts like masculine and feminine on the opposite ends of each other. So somebody could be like 80% feminine, 90% masculine, and 40% other, right? So it has gender identity, which is saying is, kind of in your head or like in yourself, who you know yourself to be. Gender expression is what you see from the outside. Sex assigned at birth is really those genitals, chromosomes, DNA. And then who you're physically attracted to and who you're emotionally attracted to. And you can actually online, they have an editable PDF. I think this is also in like 14 or 20 different languages at this point. So really useful for adults, for young people, for yourself. I love that. Shoshana says, I've often wondered when people list she, they, or he, they, do you find that this means people generally don't mind to being referred to as either or identify as either? So I'm going to have Leo speak in a second. As someone who was on the she, they to non-binary femme pipeline, for me, it was a way of trying out they as a pronoun to see if it worked well for me. But for some people, really either of them are okay. For some people, they do that so that it doesn't feel as crappy when people misgender them, and they can be like, well, I guess they just chose, that pronoun instead. I've seen people who use they, he, or they, she, and in those cases, I try to use they more than he or she. If I see he, they, or she, they, I try to use it about 50-50. But again, it really depends on the person. And when I see that, I just usually alternate, unless somebody asks differently. But Leo, do you want to share kind of as a he, they?
Yeah, as someone that uses he, they, so I started just using he and him, and then I wanted to be sure that I was more visible in my transness. And so I've added the they to make sure that as a trans masculine person, that passes really well. So when you see me on the street, you look at me, you're going to assume I'm a man. But I'm a trans man, and that trans part of my identity is actually super important to me. It's not going to be important to everyone, but to me, that's important. So using he and they, I use them interchangeably. I don't have a preference for one or the other. But for me, it helps visualize that I am a trans person and represents me in that way.
Awesome. Thank you, Leo. Will you head forward again? So I just want to put out a note. I just want to share how important this work is for many, many ways. And I want to note that the vast majority of negative mental health outcomes experienced by trans young people and gender diverse young people are due to stigma and transphobia and horrible policies, and not because being trans is somehow inherently connected to mental health issues. I also want to share that these numbers, at least to me, continue to be shocking and horrifying and really trigger my anxiety and depression seeing them. So please be gentle with yourselves. But I think it's important that we note these, and then we're going to go into an upswing from here. But I don't think we can go forward without acknowledging this. So studies that have been completed, I do have them in the resources at the end, the reference list. And so I tried to put the years that I knew the data was from. Is that 54.8% of high school age trans and gender diverse youth had clinical depression within the past 12 months, so over half. 50.5%, again, over half of transgender and gender diverse youth completed some sort of non-suicidal self-injury in the past 12 months. Over a quarter, so 28.3% of high school age transgender and gender diverse youth attempted suicide in the past 12 months. And I want you to compare those numbers to 13%, 17%, and 7% of the general youth population. So when we talk about this being an urgent health crisis, we are not being hyperbolic. Like, these numbers are horrific. Next slide. Similarly, trans and gender diverse young people already experience incredibly high rates of violence. So over 50% of them have ever experienced sexual violence, compared to 9.7% of all high school age youth, right? So about 5 times the number. A little over a quarter had experienced sexual assault in the past 12 months. 89% reported ever having experienced physical partner or dating violence. 59% reported having ever experienced psychological partner or dating violence. And another study found that almost 30% had experienced partner or dating violence previously. Next slide. And while some of this is a bit out of date, almost 90% of transgender and gender diverse young people had experienced in-person bullying of some sort due to their gender identity expression. And the only study I can find that specifically looked at online bullying as a whole, using a larger sample, 62% had experienced online bullying. And this was before TikTok, this was before Instagram, before Snapchat, before FaceTime, I mean, all of these things. So if you think about 62% over 10 years ago, you can imagine, and especially with the pandemic. So question, nice people said nice things about the presentation. Beth says the numbers are from 2015. Do you think things have gotten better? And this actually leads really well into Leo's policy section, because I think some things have gotten better, and I think that actually is going to make things much worse, because a lot of trans and gender diverse young people have started coming out over the past few years in ways that they didn't think they could before. And because they realized they could do it younger, they could get puberty blockers to make sure that they figured out what their hormones are, to get into place, because they had a good therapist who was willing to, connect them with folks. But the policies and the laws, the edict in Texas, the Don't Say Gay bill, what's happening in Alabama, what happened in, was it Idaho that passed it right away, the non-felony one, but banning healthcare, like, these things are happening so fast and so intently that you can imagine somebody who is in the midst of receiving affirmative treatment suddenly no longer can. And so I think violence and bullying of trans young people are going to increase exponentially, is my personal thought. But Carolyn says, I've attended other presentations that we've done. The reason that she's on today is that both Florida's ridiculousness and now Alabama's actions, what are ways we can help youth feel welcome and help them both keep them and ourselves safe? Well, next slide.
There we go.
I'll let Leo talk about that, and then we have some things that you can do.
Yes, we'll eventually get there. Absolutely. And I think before we talk about these current policies, to kind of expand upon this historical context that Shanna was speaking to, generally what we know anytime there is a social movement, when we see progress in the social movement, so in this case with the TGG or Transgender Diverse Justice Movement that had increased visibility and representation kind of through, I want to say, the Obama era, right? And so when I say representation, I'm including media representation, language being more visible and public and accessible to people of all ages, but in particular to young people, right? And so then more people of all ages are coming out as transgender, diverse, non-binary, et cetera, right? Because this movement it's moving forward, it's progressing our society. And anytime there's a social movement progressing society, there's always a counter movement that comes and tries to regress that progress. And that is exactly where we are, and we have been for quite some time. I would say we could do it based on presidential administrations, but it doesn't have to depend on that because the counter movement would have emerged regardless, and it did. But that historical context around social movements is important, and we're at this kind of crucial moment of the trans justice movement. And I will say one of my biggest worries that I've always spoke to Shanna about was what's going to happen to trans young people when their rights get taken away from them, when they grew up with those rights. And we're also seeing that same narrative around abortion access too, around people with uteruses being able to access abortions and what happens when that goes away. And these are the regression of rights absolutely will harm the health and well-being of people. We've seen it, and it's going to continue to get worse until it gets better. So that brings us to our current policy landscape. And I'm going to talk specifically about what we know is happening now. There's lots of bills that we've had since 2015. There's been lots of anti-trans bills that have been presented that cover lots of different topics. What I don't have here is about restrooms, because that's actually not being focused on right now at the extent as these other bills and issues are. So what we're seeing, and as of 2 weeks ago, last time I looked it up, there was almost 200 bills across the nation brought up or introduced in state legislatures that were anti-trans and or anti-LGBTQ plus, focusing just on young people, right? So that's excluding non-discrimination bills, trying to make it legal to discriminate against trans people. This is just focusing on targeting young trans people. So you've probably heard about these in the media. Shanna's referenced a few of them already. One that we've been seeing pop up so much is around sports and banning trans youth, particularly trans women or trans girls, from participating in sports. This is passed in a bunch of states. And it's the argument in support of banning trans people from sports has been debunked for years. In fact, the Olympics Council, as well as the NCAA, I'm not a sports person, I think that's the right term for it, right? They have their own policies about trans athletes that they've been implemented since 2015. So the best practices and the policies exist, but state legislatures are going even further to say, nope, we just want to do an outright ban. And one of the most heartbreaking stories I heard this was maybe a month ago, was in Utah. The state legislature passed a ban of trans athletes or young people participating in sports in their schools. And the governor, who's a Republican, but we can't deny the partisanship of these issues, it's there. The governor, who's a Republican, actually vetoed that bill because when he was doing the research, he found out that there was only one known trans young person playing sports at their school in the whole state of Utah, that this whole bill was focused on targeting one young person. And so he vetoed the bill. And then the state legislature 2/3 overrode his veto so that it became law for one trans person. Right. And we shouldn't be making laws about one person, right? Laws are supposed to be for the collective, not for individuals, right? So that's one piece, is the sports bans. We've also heard this, don't say gay or no promo homo, which, yes, is focused, when we're seeing it in the media, it's represented as a sexual orientation issue, but really it's focused on trans young people and making sure that nothing about gender identity and gender expression is being shared in schools at all ages. And I think it's important to say that when there are books or representation or discussions about LGBTQ plus history, experiences and stories, it's always age appropriate. And so when we take that away, and that access to that information away from young people, we're taking away their ability to make informed decisions about themselves, who they are, to know who they are. And so for me, when I often talk to my mom, who is super affirming of who I am, and I used to say, I'm like, I wish I had the language we have now so that my life as a teenager would have been so much easier, because I just thought I was a weirdo, right? I didn't know, but if I had access to the age appropriate information we have now, my life would look totally different, and my journey would have looked different. And that would have been incredibly affirming and important for me. And so now I'm kind of like, how do I be the adult, the young person I needs, right? And so that's who I am now. So that's another piece, is taking information out of schools that was already age appropriate. We're also seeing this attack on banning gender affirming healthcare access. And this means puberty blockers, which, again, there's so much research on puberty blockers. All they do is block the onset of puberty for young people so that you don't develop in ways that are actually really traumatic for trans people to develop their bodies in ways that they don't want it to. So it's a life-saving treatment, if you want to call it, for young people with limited side effects. And it's completely reversible. As soon as you go off those puberty blockers, you hit puberty. And then also for older teens, 16, 17, who do decide to take hormone or hormone replacement therapy, whatever you want to call it, banning access to that as well. And, you know, and one of the laws, maybe it was Alabama, one goes all the way up to the age of 19, which in my memory, I thought 18 is when you're no longer a minor generally, right? And so they're kind of, one, they're overreaching, and two, this is life-saving treatment. Three, usually when you have a relationship with a provider, you and your provider and your family, if you're a minor, your parents, your guardians, make the decisions, you know, not the legal system. Don't get to make decisions on what your healthcare looks like. And then these healthcare access bills, some of them go a step further to actually criminalize the providers who provide this care. And this is where social workers are part of this. I mean, to be part of the solution to these problems, because this targets any social workers working with trans young people who are providing any kind of gender affirming care. So not only providers, but some of these, especially that Texas memo from the Attorney General, focuses on criminalizing parents of trans kids for being affirming of their kids. And it's all terribly heartbreaking in many ways. And I think it's also important that these aren't just trans issues. This is intersectional, right? So I already talked about there's an intersection between limiting bodily autonomy, censorship. The censorship of information in schools around trans folks is very similar to the censorship of information and historical context around racism and white supremacy in the United States, and what we're seeing, the attack on critical race theory. And then the criminalization of folks who want to access healthcare and make decisions on their body and to access information are being criminalized. And we can also make the connection between when you have a felony, you also can't vote. And so this is all connected. Real quick, I do want to state that both the National Association of Social Workers and all of the state chapters, as well as the Council for Social Work Education, all support gender affirming care, access, and treatment for trans people of all ages. However, even though they have these statements of support and non-discrimination, in response to what's happening at the national and state level right now, there's been a silence and delay to respond. And that is a huge disservice to our field, to us as social workers, and I call on them to do better. And also, all credible professional associations support youth access to gender affirming care and support the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association. The list goes on and on. There's all support, all associations support this. So again, the best practices are there. The experts know and support this. The research is there. However, we're going against research. We're going against what we know to pass these really harmful laws. All right, back to you, Shanna.
So I'm actually going to skip through the quotes. I did put the paper, it's a PDF that says I didn't come here to make trouble. I did a study with a group out of Kansas looking at rural transgender and gender diverse youth about their resilience and how that it becomes resistance. And so because we're talking about a lot of negative things, I also again, young people and trans young people are so scrappy and are doing beautiful work in these spaces that don't allow and appreciate and support them. So that paper is in there. You can see these quotes and many more. So I'm going to have you skip through the next few slides, Leo, just because of timing, which is fine. So going back to those questions, what can you do? So the first thing you can do is establish clear non-discrimination policies in your workplace that explicitly include gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. This is especially important if you are in one of the 20 plus states that does not have statewide policies that protect around sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. So if you are in a state such as, I'm guessing, I'm just naming them off the top of my head, like Utah or Georgia, or 20 plus states where somebody can be fired for being trans, they can be kicked out of a bathroom for being trans, or even legally penalized for that, they can be denied housing, all of those things. Putting in your practice, whether it's a community org, nonprofit, whether it's you as a legislator and who you're supporting, whether it's a private practice or community mental health, being very clear that those are enumerated rather than just wrapped up is a big deal. But then you also have to support that, right? So developing strategies to maintain a diverse and culturally responsive providers and staff. I cannot tell you the number of times I've been asked to go in and do a training. I do a training, everybody seems awesome. I start referring people there. And about 6 months or 9 months later, I hear a complaint from someone about how crappy someone was to them. And because we have rotating staff in a lot of these places or rotating providers, those people hadn't gone to the training. And this is not just around trans topics. This is around ableism. This is around queer stuff. I mean, everything, right? And so making sure that as people come in, they're getting this information, making sure it's more than just a one-off, like, here, I hand you a gender unicorn, don't be a jerk to your clients, but making sure that people actually understand what that means, what it means to use someone's pronouns, what it means to share your own pronouns, what it means to fix your face so that when somebody says I'm a trans horror, glitter femme, instead of being like, what the frat, you're like, oh, okay, tell me more about that. Knowing who to, okay, then we'll go to the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. So then, because when you have that anti-discrimination piece, you're able to report unfriendly and discriminatory practices, even within your own practice, which might suck. It might be really feel harmful to call out your colleague, but whether you're reporting them to their supervisor or to HR or at a larger scale, when people are doing things that are harmful, I want you to think back to that slide with 50% of folks having completed an SSI, with more than 50% of young people having depression in the past year, with almost a third having attempted suicide. Those rates are astronomical, right? And so it's things like this. Call someone in. If they keep doing it, call someone out. If they keep doing it, report that. But also, on the other hand, know who the referrals are, who are friendly, aware, and knowledgeable. If you're a youth mental health provider, know who the people are that you can refer them to about gender affirming care. If you live in a state where you cannot get gender affirming care, know whether the laws mean you can cross the border. And so know referrals in nearby states so that if somebody needs to travel for it, they can get access to that. Amy asked if we'll send out the PowerPoint. Emma, I think, is going to include it with a post information. She has access to it. So I think a recording as well. Yes, Emma's going to share these things. So continuing educating yourself and others about this, right? Our one-off 90-minute workshop will not cover you for the next 10 years, right? And so making sure that it's, reading books, listening to podcasts, following young trans people on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter. And again, this goes for all groups. As a white person, I try to follow lots of trans folks of color, lots of trans feminine folks who have different experiences than I do. So I really encourage you to kind of go out and make sure that you are inputting that information. Julie says it's very valuable to know where to not refer to someone if they're not gender affirming. Yes, right. And then make that clear, right? Like, we as social workers have a responsibility to gatekeep people who are harmful in our community. And so you might say, this person is really great around XYZ, but please never refer a trans young person there. And that is okay. And then again, train all staff, including your front desk staff, your custodial staff, your billing staff. This comes up a lot. Leo, is it okay if I share a past experience of yours? Yes. Okay. So when Leo was trying to get top surgery, everybody there, the doctors were amazing, the nurses were amazing. And then we had to go to this billing meeting, and it was pardon my language, it was a shit show. And this billing person had no idea how to talk in a trans affirming way, like misgendered Leo, kept talking about like breast removal, right? Because nobody had thought to train the billing person, right? So everybody should be inclusive, not just the social workers on staff. And I think, Leo, last slide. So have gender inclusive bathrooms and signs to them, right? Because sometimes there'll be like one gender inclusive bathroom in the building, and then somebody has to ask where it is. So make sure that that's labeled by the gendered bathrooms. Post your non-discrimination policies. Hand them out when people come in. Put them on the walls. Put them on your website. Make it clear that you are affirming of people with gender diverse experience. Come up with inclusive names, right? Like, try not to call something a women's clinic or a women's nonprofit, a women's shelter. Don't divide if you're working with young people in groups. Don't do things by boys and girls, but do something about like Android or iPhone or purple or green, right? And ask people to divide by their favorite colors, right? But we don't use something as arbitrary as boys and girls, because then people have to decide, and what if you don't fit, or do you come out in that situation? Make sure your materials, your collateral are inclusive. That includes having trans and gender diverse people in your stock photos. Have referral lists of inclusive providers. Make sure you have inclusive intake forms. Even if you need to know their legal name and the sex on their insurance card, just say that, and then say, what is the name you use and what are your pronouns? For people who don't care about their pronouns, you are not going to harm anybody by asking for them. But for people who need their correct pronouns used and are often not getting that, that can be huge. But if you ask for them, you have to use them, right? Which goes back to that one point. If you take anything away from me, use those pronouns and names. Advertise in trans community spaces, right? Because we want to know, like, are you actually thinking of us? Or is this just like, oh, I guess I've gotten the name as being the trans provider. Put pronouns on your name badges or name tags, right? Like, it shouldn't just be your client getting that information. Again, if you actually are doing inclusive work, put rainbow or trans flags online or in locations so that people know to find you, because it can be so hard, and everybody has underground networks, but especially for trans and gender diverse youth, they have less resources to plug into those spaces and to know those networks. And so being able to see a trans flag somewhere can be a huge indication. And lastly, hire trans and non-binary employees, right? Like, even if you yourself are cisgender, if you have a trans coworker, that's going to give like a little light bulb to someone that your place is actually trans inclusive and is actually thinking about these things. If you have a trans person on office staff, you have someone who's going to do the good form, the intake forms, and make sure those things are good, so it doesn't fall on, the one person that's doing something. So those are my low-hanging fruit. And then Leo is going to tell you how to do storytelling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we think about kind of the systems level change that we can do, our interpersonal relationships, community, advocacy and inclusive behaviors is important. But if we want to respond to the political environment now, and this is not just for trans issues, this could be for any policy you're interested in advocating around, telling your story to facilitate change is an incredibly powerful way to get involved in decision-making and policymaking. And I say telling your story because this is specifically about you telling your story, because you as a citizen, your thoughts and voice matter. And also your practice as a social worker can influence policies. And sharing your experiences, what you're hearing on the ground, working with communities, working with trans folks can make the difference and shift how legislators vote and support an affirmation of trans young people. So, but it's telling your story, not someone else's story. And then what happens when we can support others in telling their story, which is a lot of what social workers do, right? We like to think about empowerment. We talk about capacity building and individual agency and collective agency. Yes, absolutely, we can do all those things. And telling our stories is the focus of this training. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk a little bit about conversations that we like and don't like. We're going to talk about how it feels in our bodies. We're going to talk about what happens in our bodies scientifically. And then we're going to go through a process of how do we connect with people when we're in disagreement with them. And in particular, in this case, policymakers who may be in disagreement with us. So in the chat, if you can just throw out, we'll start with enjoy. What are some topics that you enjoy talking about? Easy topics to chat about with others. Cats, food, books, nerdy stuff, kids, yoga, running, pugs, cats and dogs, yeah, we'll just pets. Food, music, movies, yes, Netflix. All right, what are some topics that are less enjoyable to talk about? And if you can see my emoji, it says nope, 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 and it's running away. Taxes, I'm gonna say kids, no, I'm just kidding, kids was something good. Politics, death, hobbies, religion, politics, spiders, income, sickness, social studies and science education, weight loss, money, bad diagnoses, IRS, homelessness, politics. And a lot of the societal issues that we're facing right now are hard to talk about, especially because we're so polarized as a society. Weather can be hard to talk about, could also be enjoyable. Okay, so yes, there's lots of things that we enjoy talking about and things that we don't enjoy talking about. And when we're in those conversations of things that maybe make us feel a little uneasy or uncomfortable talking about, what do you feel when you're having those challenging or uncomfortable conversations? What is happening in your body? How does it feel? Nervous, heart racing, lonely, heaviness, anxiety, tense, eyes lose focus, gut tightens, tense and visible, lump in throat, alone, stress, want to run away, literally, increased heart rate. Yes, all these are fight or flight response or freeze initiates, right? When we're engaging in these conversations that are uncomfortable or challenging, right? And there is a scientific reason for why this happens. And I'm not that kind of a scientist. I'm a social scientist. So I'm going to give my best overview of what's happening in the brain when we engage in challenging conversations. But the first thing to think about and know is that your amygdala, which is the powerhouse of your emotions in your brain, becomes activated when we're feeling threatened or anxious or nervous. It's like, oh, well, I'm alert now, I'm here. And then it takes over. And when your amygdala takes over, your capacity for understanding becomes limited because you're in this response, right? This reaction phase. And so, someone talking sweetly to you about, butterflies and rainbows is not going to be very helpful. Persuasion also becomes nearly impossible because you're in this reactionary state. And because you're sitting in defensiveness and resistance. So that's the sign your brain is responding to this, and it's hard then your mind-body response. It's harder to get your mind to take over because you're in your brain. So how do you respond as the person engaging in this and you're seeing someone, their amygdala is responding, reacting to you or what you're saying? How can you respond? Number one, if it's safe for you to do so and you consent, right? That's important. Those are the parameters that it has to be safe for you and you must consent to this. I'm not saying go out in the middle of the street and start talking to people you see randomly. Make sure it's strategic and that you're okay doing so. But you want to meet people where they are. right? And you want to affirm and think about what they might be going through and asking those questions. Similar to asking someone, what does that mean to you? You could ask someone, what are you feeling right now? Can you tell me more about this thing that you just said? I'm curious about, why your face is red right now, right? And be curious about what's going on for you. What else we can do is to identify some universal values or narratives that we all generally share. So yes, I'm making a generalization. Some of those values include the fact that most of us in some contexts believe that family matters, right? And everyone is someone's parent, child, sibling, etc. Now, this isn't going to apply to everyone, but for most people, again, generally, this concept, this value of family matters is important. And we saw this in action a lot during the Obama administration, because President Obama would refer to his wife and my daughters when trying to pass the Affordable Care Act and women equity bills and things like that. He would often center himself in relation to the people in his lives, right? Because his family matters. Another common universal value that we share in the US is this concept of saying, oh, I wonder what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes, right? I don't know what that's like, but it can be hard. Another value in the US is this concept of fairness. And so fairness is not justice and fairness is not equity, but the concept of fairness. Everyone deserves a fair shot or a fair chance. And another universal value or narrative is that most folks want people to listen and hear them and be asked questions and feel validated, right? And so sometimes people just want to be heard. And so when we're entering into challenging conversations, remembering some of these values that we all generally share helps to ground us in how and what we say and how we want to frame it. And also, we should be conscious of our own resistance, because we're having a reaction too, and that's totally fine, right? And that's where, if it's not worth it for you or you don't feel safe in consenting to do so, then this is not the time or place to have your conversation. But when you're agreeing to do it, right, you might have resistance too and be like, oh man, I want to get in on it, right? So in general, it's helpful to assume that people are coming from a place of good rather than bad. Right? Understand that you're learning and growing and other people are also learning and growing, there's many alumni in the room right now. And, through social work education, we have so much access to information about justice and equity, and policy, right? And progressive ideals, right? But not everyone has that same access to the education around social justice. Right. And remember that we started somewhere too. We weren't always this informed about what's going on in the world around us. We all have to start somewhere. Remembering that there are very strong dominant narratives that reinforce white supremacy and, I would say, cis hetero patriarchy in our society. And these are narratives we hear every day. So when those things get challenged, it's easy for us to move into a place of shame because we're so bombarded with these narratives that uphold this. So that gets challenged and we're like, oh, what's wrong with me that I hold this narrative that isn't real or is harmful, et cetera, right? And one of those narratives is the bootstrap narratives, right? Like, I can lift myself up from my own bootstraps, right? But when we challenge that, right, it makes people's amygdala activate and say, hey, wait, that's not true. That's not true for me. What am I going to do with that, right? And another thing to remember is that we can't meet emotions with statistics and data. As much as I hate saying this out loud, because I love stats and I love data, I'm a researcher, and there is a time and a place for them. But when we're having a conversation that's deeply rooted in challenging dominant narratives, we have to meet emotions with emotions, because we have to find that personal connection. So how do we build that case why do we build that case for personal connection? Number one, it helps to decrease that anxiety and confusion that's caused by this kind of amygdala response or reaction, right? And an easy way we can do this is to be aware of the jargon we might be using, right? So all these new terms that you might have learned, the acronyms of the LGBTQ plus community, all of that is jargon to some folks, right? And so just be aware of what we're saying and how we're saying it. And also it helps to acknowledge that when we're learning about new words, new terminology, new communities, that it can be confusing and complex. And we can say, yeah, it is confusing. It might be complex, but like Shannon was saying, doesn't mean you get to disrespect someone, right? And bringing it back down to those values, right? But what we want to do is decrease that anxiety and confusion. Then we can increase that capacity for understanding and empathy, right? Because we're assuming people have good intentions, right? And so when we remove those highly academic terms or terms that are biased or can be perceived as biased or jargony, right? We can start personalizing our connection with someone. And that's why it's important to use your story, not someone else's, because you're the one in front, or whether in person or virtually, in front of that person. And so using your story and your experiences helps to build that understanding and empathy, because you probably share a lot too, a lot of similar common experiences. And then through that, you get to increase that person's capacity for support, and you really get to find their personal connection to the issue as well. And that gives you this foundation to keep moving forward. Those of you engaged in policy work at any level probably heard of changing hearts and minds, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're changing hearts and minds. And it's very cliche, but I kind of still love it. I'm still going to use this terminology, hearts and minds. It's important, right? And so our stories are a really powerful way to shape attitudes and beliefs, because when we share them well, they can get us to a place of understanding and compassion. And for the most part, everyone knows the kind of rhythm of a story, right? There's a protagonist, there's an antagonist, the plot thickens, and then there's a happy ending, right? And so we have to shape those stories and get to those happy endings. And we do that by sharing our stories. And by doing that story arc, we can help make sense of complex, unfamiliar, or uncomfortable topics, right? We make it comfortable. We make it a shared experience. We say, hey, we've all been there. It's okay. We got this. We're in this together. So why tell your story? Number one, it helps you meet people where they are. It helps you develop a sense of shared values, and it helps develop that personal connection, which is often the make it or break it way to get someone to influence someone's decisions, in particular policymakers' decisions. So I'm going to move into a framework for how to tell your story. And I'm going to give you a blueprint. I don't think we're going to have time to do much practice, but I'm going to give you this blueprint. You'll have the slides. You'll take it with you. You'll practice your story. It'll be wonderful. And so first, we need to think about and frame our story, right? And we do this by identifying who we are. We have to identify, what do we care about? What is the issue at hand? So what is it? And why do you care about it? Why is it important to you? Why do you care about trans youth? Why do you think someone else should care about it? And how can you connect with other folks about it? How can someone connect with you? What are you asking them to do, right? Having a clear ask, whether it's, can you vote in support of this? Can you write a letter to your city council member? Will you ask pronouns of all your students in the classroom, right? What is your ask, and being clear about that? So this blueprint really makes this succinct story, and it can be as long as short as you want. It depends on the context of you sharing your story. So again, this is primarily for policymakers. So the shorter and sweeter, the better. But you start off identifying yourself as a social worker, a parent, a human being, an alum of the University of Michigan, right? So you're identifying yourself and placing yourself in connection to the issue you want to talk about. You say, I believe, right? And this is where you state what you care about, the issue that you're talking about. And in fact could be data, but it doesn't have to be data. This could be your experience. This could be something you want to share, right? But it's kind of framing what you believe in the bigger story, in the bigger picture of how it impacts others, and in this case, trans young people. And then you make that connection, you do that ask, can I count on you to do this? So, because I can't just be like, here's a blueprint, go do it. Here's an example. So for me, I would go to this is at a school board meeting, right? I'd go, as a trans social worker, I believe that all LGBTQ plus young people deserve access to safe and supportive school environments. In fact, research shows that LGBTQ plus young people who feel unsafe at school are also more likely to report feeling depressed and are even more likely to have thoughts about suicide. Yet Michigan has no laws protecting LGBTQ plus students from bullying, harassment, and violence at school. Can I count on you, XYZ school member, to vote yes to protecting all of our students by passing this anti-bullying policy for XYZ school district? All right, so this is a short and sweet story, giving them this is the issue I'm talking about. This is a fact about it. And I could have gone into more detail and been like, as a trans person, my experience in school looked like this. I was bullied. And then I have a clear ask. Another example that I've done before is we were working on, this is back in Colorado a few years ago, we were working on a bill to modernize how you can update the gender marker on birth certificates in the state of Colorado. And it just so happened that I was testifying in the committee for it a couple of weeks after I was in a pretty bad car accident and went to the emergency room. And at the time, I didn't change my gender marker on my social security. So when I checked into the ER and they pulled up my social security number and they gave me my bracelet, there was a big F on it. And so when I was doing my testimony about the importance of gender markers, I brought my bracelet and I was like, as a trans Coloradan, that people don't think I'm an F, but my F is right here. And I was able to frame the story about my experience and why that impacts people, why this bill needed to pass and how it impacted me, right? And so it's the framing and rooting it in your own experience. So take some time. We're not going to spend too much time because we don't have that much time left, but think about what your story is based on what you've learned today and how you want folks to take action here in Michigan. I believe there is a Don't Say Gay bill in the Michigan legislature right now.
I believe they're getting ready to pass they're getting ready to put forward an anti gender affirming care bill also. But I also want to note, because you're talking about big P policy, is that this policy could also be like, I know we have staff and faculty at the School of Social Work, right? Or if you work at the Department of Health or Michigan Medicine, right? Like your ask could be within for those policies too.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, this could be used in lots of different ways, primarily when making a decision. So again, the big P policy way, asking folks for fundraising. This is a great tool for fundraising. If you're campaigning, if you want to get involved in some of the ballot initiatives that are out there, getting signatures, providing input on a meeting. Especially I talk to students about, as an intern, if you maybe feel a little uncomfortable sharing your voice at the staff meeting, frame it, use this tool to just tell your story, why you think to share your input on what that decision is. And it can also be used to start a discussion. Another way it could be used is to make a decision with a partner. And so sometimes I go to Shanna and I'm like, as a doc student, I'm feeling super exhausted and tired. And I know you had a hard week too. Maybe we should treat ourselves to dinner tonight and get takeout. I have a coupon at the place over there. Can I count on you to support us getting takeout tonight?
Can I count on you to decide where we're going? Because
that's a whole other.
Us can never decide where we want to go.
That's a whole other conversation or training. But if you want to practice, you want to develop your own story. Here's your framework: the as a, I believe, in fact, can I count on you? And believe me, it can be this simple. It does not have to be more complicated than this to share your voice and share your story. You can simplify it as much as you want. And then we do have some questions to reflect on. Shanna, do you want to take the lead on this?
As we reach
we're supposed to ask. What? We have the poll questions too.
We talked about it. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Emma said we're getting enough participation. Y'all don't have to do silly poll questions. So as we reach the end of our training today, I always like to, and I think Leo does too, to get some buy-in. Here's my ask. As a trainer on topics, as a non-binary person who trains about my own community, I have a lot of anxiety that people just sit through these trainings and don't actually do anything. And it's important for me to know that what you are doing is impactful in the community, and that the work that Leo and I have done ripples out into the community. So can I count on you to answer one or more of these questions in the chat? How was that for my storytelling? Ask Boo. Good. Okay. So how could inclusivity of trans and gender diverse young people play a role in your practice? Or sharing what steps you're already taking. I use the term healthcare, but really gender affirming environment at all. What steps are you already taking? What community resources do you have that you can use? Or how are you including trans people in your ongoing education and assessment of your practice? So I'd just like to ask folks to take one last moment to think about that. Yana says, over the years, I've actually educated a physician about using correct pronouns, did this multiple times until he started doing it. Awesome. Thank you for your advocacy in that space. Angela said community resources, getting involved with the school districts, inclusivity diversity committee. Amy teaches child psychiatry fellows, and this information is important. So yes, we'll send the slides. Carolyn says advocacy happens daily in her role to be inviting of every person in the community. Helen says using chosen names and pronouns and advocating for coworkers to do the same. Lenora is an academic advisor. Okay, I'm going to read through all of these at the end, but I hope you all are reading and recognizing that you're not the only ones that have to do this, right? There's 80 people here in this training, and I know that having gotten together with all, I don't know what, is there 15 trans people, trans academics in the field, as well as a couple of the queer academics in response to some of these policies, we have felt so exhausted and so alone due to the lack of, especially cisgender people speaking out in the field. And so as I read these, this makes me feel like I belong here, that I am supposed to be in social work, and that this is the right place to be. So I'm going to save the chat so that I can fill my cup looking at these. So I thank you for the work that you have done and the work that you're going to continue to do to make this more inclusive.
Absolutely. And I just want to add a note too, that sometimes when we're talking about that big P policy, it can feel really overwhelming and we can feel powerless. And so all these things that we do on our day-to-day help influence and change that big P policy over time. And it's hard because over time is not soon enough, right? We need to challenge this now. And unfortunately, that's not realistic. All right. A lot of these policies have already passed. And there's a question that was submitted: how can I elevate policies that are gender affirming and at their place of employment? And sometimes, you know, if something passes that isn't, right, it's a great opportunity for you, depending on your own positionality within that institution. Like, do you have decision-making power? Can you talk to the executive director or CEO if you can access that? If not, you know, you could talk to your supervisor and say, this isn't sitting well with me. What are your thoughts on it? What can we do about it, right? And see what they think. And, you know I've had a lot of these kinds of discussions around anti-racism work. I used to work in public health and at the Colorado Health Department. And they were hard, challenging conversations, but I kept feeling this is not okay, this is not okay, right? And staying in my curiosity, why do we do things this way? Why is this? Why is that? And just asking those questions. And then my supervisor brought it to her supervisor, who brought it to her supervisor, right? And then eventually there was this broader conversation around anti-racism at the health department. So while maybe we can't change that big P policy, we can change hearts and minds of the people around us that we most often interact with. And it takes sometimes you have to be a little brave and really push yourself out there and go outside your comfort zone, which is what being a social worker is all about.
Yeah, and we do this work in community, right? Like, we can't do this on our own. So please don't feel like you're on your own. We're connected. We are doing this. Our contact information is here on the screen, and then Emma will send this out as well. We're both on Twitter. I'm Dr. Shanna Kay. Leo is QueerSpeak. Our emails are here. Please don't call me. It's my work phone, and I haven't been to the office in 2 years, so I won't get your message. But you can check us out. Thank you again for showing up. And yeah, I appreciate you taking your time. And we're around if we can support you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you both so much. And thank you everyone for attending. This was our last session. What a way to close out our Building Healthy Strong Communities conference. You all were really wonderful participating in the chat and allowing you to not participate in the polls. So fantastic, and wonderful facilitators for getting that participation. Just a quick little reminder, If you are here for CEUs, please give our wonderful continuing education office at least a week or two to get those evaluations out to you. They are extremely busy, and not only are they managing the 5 CE sessions that we just hosted these past 2 days, but all of the CE presentations that come out of the School of Social Work. So please give them some grace and allow them a couple weeks to get you those evaluations. If you do have any questions relating to your CEUs, please contact them. I'm going to put their email address in the chat. I am not the one that provides the CEUs. I work in the Office of Development and Alumni Relations, not the Office of Continuing Education. I know it can be very confusing, but so please reach out to them. One last thing I'm going to say, we're offering a very informal closing reception at 3:45. That's just in about 12 minutes. If you would like to join us, that would be wonderful. We're just going to be debriefing all of the sessions, all of the topics that we covered these last 2 days, and also talking about how social work has had to really change over the course of the pandemic these last 2 years. So thank you again to Leo and Shanna for being here. I know I learned a lot, and so did everyone else. I hope you all get to enjoy the sunshine. If you're in Michigan, have a wonderful day. Stay safe.